1800s, standing in the middle of a prairie, the long grain wheat sways in the evening breeze. The chirping of birds softly echo as the day draws to an end. Peering up, the vast open fields call out as an opportunity for growth and freedom. For me, growing up in Chicago, in these trails and looking out into all these prairie-type landscapes and experiencing all these things, so use your imagination, picture yourself in a prairie as we talk about prairie landscape and the ideology today. But Johnny, what do you have to say about the prairie?
Yeah, well, it reminds me a lot of our early discussions about the development of Chicago and the way the agriculture revolution transformed the way we see Chicago by introducing the transportation increases, the developments in shipping, and these elements all came together to grow the city into the way we see the urban context of it today. And that led to an expansion of the suburbans surrounding the outskirts of it.
Right, and I think from my perspective, it was just, or at least a few weeks ago in Professor Watson's class, we read Building Suburbia, a portion from it, and I found it interesting because it seemed like all the people wanted to be more closer to nature. It was, if you will, a more relaxational portion of nature and just wanting to be closer to it. So that's, I feel like with that growth of suburbia also introduced the prairie theme into what we're going to be talking about today. But everyone should know Frank Lloyd Wright, right?
Well, of course. I mean, he grew up in the Chicago area, and he was a pioneer for the Prairie House. He saw the effects from the agricultural revolution as he got into architecture, and he saw the way the vast prairies and potential land changed into industrial complexes, and with the suburbans being this saving grace and giving residents the opportunity to experience the prairies in developing cities, with the suburbs being the saving grace to the residents and giving an opportunity to experience the prairies while the city was developing. But the real question is, how do we see these prairies in the suburban environment as Frank Lloyd Wright designs these prairie houses, both the interior and exterior? And what characteristics does he draw on? What do you say to this, Beatrice?
Yeah, to answer that, I think we first need to investigate the context in which we find these homes. And to do so, I think a quote that could also lead us into this discussion is from the Hired Hands book, page 49, to start the quote. Ready markets and high prices for wheat drew agricultural settlers, bringing capital and labor. The promise of agricultural growth attracted developmental and investmental capital from government and private investors. The combination of a rapid and massive increase in labor's productive capacity and capital's lavish investment, creating a striking but temporary phenomena of great prosperity, end quote. So I think for our conversational topic today, to tie us back to Frank Lloyd Wright, is going to be mostly, Johnny, if you want to...
Yeah, so it's going to be comparing and contrasting the way we see the suburban landscape and its development to the idealization of the prairies through the forms and the experiences of the prairie house that Frank Lloyd Wright described, how we will see these in both the interior and exteriors of the houses, and what way were these presented to people.
Yeah, and to lead us into the context of today's podcast, I think before we get into like the body that we're going to be discussing, I want to start us out with a quote from a book called The Prairie in 19th Century American Poetry by Steve Olson. And it says, start quote, "The ideology suggested by this sketch of American expansion and manifest destiny is the foundation of the poetic metaphor of the prairie and plains. The metaphor initially made its way into the literature of the prairies and plains through journals of exploration, guidebooks, and travel books, in which images of the prairie and plains became conventionalized and publicized," end quote.
And I think this quote came about because people saw the prairie as a form of freedom that had not been experienced before, and a way to truly express themselves. And become their own person.
Right.
And we see this as well in the way that the suburbs developed.
And I think where we see that a lot in reading a few weeks ago in Professor Watson's class, we talked about building suburbia, and everyone was trying to, or at least for a way of escape, or if you will, vacation in quotes. They would go to the outskirts of the town to be more closer to nature and to feel those experiences. So yeah, like you said, it is in a way to escape everything.
Yeah, and I think Frank Lloyd Wright really brought that together, combining those ideologies of escape through nature and the escape through the suburban landscape. And so his earliest works were the Prairie House, because he was able to see the transformation of both of these places. And so
Right. And I think a quote that you and I picked out to really capture this also was from Suburban Sketches by William Dean Howells. And it says, start quote, "One of the family chose deliberately to stay at home, but the severest scrutiny could not detect a hindrance in the health or circumstance of any of the rest. And the weather was delicious." Everything, in fact, was so fair and so full of promise that they could almost fancy a calamity of some sort of hanging over its perfection and possibly bred of it, end quote. And I really think to compare that back to building suburbia in our original conversation a few minutes ago about the manifest destiny and the want of being closer to nature and feeling that freedom, I think that really captures that. But even so, like going back to Frank Lloyd Wright and how we're integrating him into this topic with his prairie house style architecture, like Johnny said, he created this architectural style off of elements from the prairie itself. So the prairie house and its elements contained items like overhanging roof eaves for the sense of privacy, in contrast to a more open floor plan to synthesize the family interactions. But I find this interesting because in the Roland Furbeck house, you can see, as we have here, a picture that we're looking at. It's just really interesting because you can see the sense of openness that he was discussing, and even the doorways that are in this prairie house style are tucked away to create more sense of personal ownership. And he really does that with the Roland Furbeck house in these images that we're looking at.
yeah, he also includes on the interiors of these a lot of linear elements, both across the vertical and horizontal, that gives this natural sense through a geometric form. The Roland Furbeck house, a lot of the interior of it is made of wood, such as the flooring, there's the frames around the windows, the trims, and the cornicings. And these natural elements tie back to this natural material motif that we see through a lot of these houses, where they're either made brick, stucco, and often included a centralized chimney in them. And we see this inside the Roland Furbeck house as well. There's a centralized chimney in the midst of both the living space and the dining room.
Yeah, that also goes back to his idea of the open floor plan concept that he was going for to interact more of these family connections. But I think something that also we see in this house is the horizontal lines that he chose to reflect the Midwest prairie landscape. And you can obviously see it all over the interior of the Roland Furbeck house with his choice of wood and his materiality and how he arranged it to somewhat mimic those horizontal lines that he was talking about.
Yeah, I think another thing that helps to create this sense of privacy and personalization for these houses is the lower ceiling heights. The ceiling just barely reaches above the doorways, and in this sense, it creates a shallower space, allowing for more of a personal feeling within inside the home.
Right, and just to give a little bit more background on the Roland Furbeck house, I know we just jumped right into it without really giving much background. For anyone who doesn't know, the Roland Furbeck house is located in Oak Park, Illinois. It is currently under protection because it's one of his masterpieces, in my opinion. Obviously designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. But I find this house really interesting because I grew up in Chicago, and since this house is in Oak Park, it's super near to where I grew up at. So I find it really interesting because I've had the opportunity to see it in person, and being an architecture student, I think this really adds to the motif of being able to see these real-life architectural pieces that we know actually in person. For anyone who's ever done, study abroad, it's really exciting to see those pieces that you've studied about in Professor Watson's class and pretty much anywhere actually in person. But that was just a quick little brief. I thought we should add that, Johnny.
Yeah, going back into this tying into the suburban landscape, and like you see it tying into the prairie, but you also see it tying into the suburban landscape through the geometric forms of it. How I would describe the form of this building relates to the simplicity that people were looking for in the suburbs to escape the chaotic nature of the city and embrace more of a calming sense of life.
Right, yeah, and I think something that I also picked up on was, since this prairie house style was the integration of nature into the home, I think something that I've noticed when I'm looking at these images here of the Furbeck house is he integrates nature through some of the features, like the large windows to capture natural light, and the views, as well as like we said before, the open floor plan that affects that seamless flow between the indoor and outdoor use of the spaces. But even so, like the materialities that he was choosing for the house, the wood is from nature. It's very, very prominent within the house, and he uses like these earthy tones to correlate back to that more outdoor nature type feel. And to conclude how we're discussing this conversation, I think something that we can really pull from this conversation is how Frank Lloyd Wright used just simple things to create this architectural style in the Roland Furbeck house and other prairie house styles. So I think the takeaway today that we can really look at is, again, those use of detailing of those horizontal lines, those high-pitched roofs, the use of the stucco wood material, again, the open floor plan to really emphasize the family interactions. What else do you think? What other detailing, Johnny, do you think we should pull or take away?
I think we should also take away the relation to nature,
right,
and the relation to the suburban context itself, taking the elements such as the Roman and Greek columns in the front to pull us way back to the classical era, to nature, as well as the simplistic geometric forms to relate to the simplicity that the suburban life was looking for.
Right, and again, I think I mentioned this, I don't know, but also like the low-pitched roofs with the really emphasized broad overhanging eaves. I think that's also something we can really pull our unity towards.
Conclude our discussion today about how the prairie houses were impacted by both the suburbs and the idealization of the prairie. We see the prairie house change the suburban mindset and the way people thought about the suburbs. We see this through greater expansion of uniformity through the designs. People looking for a calm and more natural environment that we see in a lot of media depictions of the suburban landscape. Another one of these questions that I guess we could take away from this is, what other architecture was influenced by the prairies?
I got one. I could answer that, Johnny.
Yeah.
As I'm eating my crackers. We could talk about the parks and how the prairie style has influenced the urban development and growth of parks. I see it's very present right now, but even so, everyone loves to go to the park.
Right.
I mean, I go every weekend. But I think primarily evident in the design principles and philosophies that we can see is, while the prairie style may not directly influence like the objects you find in the park, I think it could really, its emphasis is placed on integrating buildings of natural landscape and creating these cohesive, harmonious environments that can really resonate with the broader movement of the parks and their development.
We see the impacts of the environment changing the way spaces perform and the way that these buildings are designed. You see in Nashville here, more on the park side, Shelby Bottoms, which is in a floodplain of Nashville. Environmental center there is raised up on a platform, and so that the 10-year floodplain does not reach the building itself. And in the broader sense, we can see that the environment plays a larger role in the way we design and can influence both the way we see things culturally and design developmentally.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I think that concludes our discussion today of Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Houses and the suburban and prairie landscapes.
Yeah, no, get out there, guys. Go to a park, take a walk in a neighborhood, see if you see the prairie landscape in the neighborhoods that we see today. You probably don't, but maybe it's something we need to really, bring back.